Chapter 13:21. After showering, she lay on the bed with her back facing him. Even if it was her side, the curve was still beautiful. He lay down beside her and felt her body stiffen in an instant. Chin Amlin lay flat and put one hand under his head. He said calmly, "I'm very tired. I don't have the energy to do anything to you. You don't have to be so chaste." Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips and didn't say a word. She was still curled up there and didn't move. Chin Amlin looked at her back and smiled. "If you sleep like this, you'll probably be stiff tomorrow morning. Don't worry, I'm not interested in wood." With that, he closed his eyes. Sleep. She waited for a long time until his breathing was even. Then, she closed her eyes. Half an hour later, Chin Amlin opened his eyes. He was sleepy, but he still waited until she fell asleep. He was used to sleeping at this hour. But he wanted to see her. Chin Amlin gently flipped her over and propped his chin on his hand as he looked at her. His eyes were dark and deep. His fingers gently stroked her face. A strand of hair covered half of her face and playfully scattered on the snow-white bathrobe. He gently pushed it away. Her appearance was very different from before. Now it was almost perfect. Chin Amlin watched on just like that, a sliver of softness slipping through his heart. After a long time, he retracted his hand, closed his eyes, and fell into a dream. In the dream, she was wearing an apron and cooking for him in the kitchen of the apartment. The morning sun shone on the side of her face. Her face was very soft, and it was more beautiful than any of the movies and scenes she had starred in. When Chin Amlin woke up, Yi Liangxiu hadn't woken up yet. He remembered that dream, and his heart couldn't help but soften a little. The way he looked at her was also gentle. He turned his body and looked at her face. He stretched out his hand and stretched his fingers down her neckline. The bathrobe spread open, and his eyes fell on her lower abdomen. It was flat and clean, without a trace. So she naturally gave birth to Mu Yun. At that moment, Chin Amlin wanted to go to the place where Mu Yun was born. With this thought in mind, he did it. When Yi Liangxiu woke up, she was trapped in his arms. His fingers were doing something indescribable. She was startled and moved back, but she almost fell off the bed after moving a few steps. Chin Amlin reached out and grabbed her. The scene froze. She was in her bathrobe, and he was fully clothed. Yi Liangxiu covered her clothes with one hand and glared at him. "Chin Amlin, what are you doing? I just want to feel the path that Mu Yun has walked." He lowered his eyes and said rather coldly. Yi Liangxiu was speechless. She moved closer and buttoned her clothes. "Rogue." He just smiled faintly and didn't say anything. When she got out of bed and went to the bathroom, he said faintly, "You seem to have a reaction just now. You should wash up." Yi Liangxiu suddenly turned her head. "You're thinking too much." He slowly raised his finger at her. "Evil." She slammed the bathroom door shut and leaned against the door. Her legs were trembling. Biting her lip, she took a shower and went out. When she returned to the bedroom, Chin Amlin was not there. She heard some noise in the dining room, so she changed her clothes and went out. Chapter 13:22. I haven't eaten for nearly 24 hours. Chin Amlin's voice was a little faint. "Do you mind if I eat first?" Even though he said that, he took good care of little Mu Yun. Yi Liangxiu pursed her lips, sat down, and ate her breakfast in silence. In the silence, Chin Amlin looked up at her. She had tied her long hair into a ponytail today. She was wearing a thin knitted sweater and white slacks, which made her figure even more perfect, especially revealing a small part of her charming waist. He didn't remember that she liked to dress like this. However, his gaze lingered on it for a while longer before he said, "After breakfast, take Mu Yun to the hospital for a checkup." Yi Liangxiu looked up at him and said, "You don't believe me? I'm the child's father. Is there a problem with caring for him?" His gaze fell on her face, and then he lowered his head to continue cutting the bread in his hand. His voice became even fainter. "Also, Liangxiu, are you sure you want to say that in front of the child?" Yi Liangxiu was stunned. He called her Liangxiu. He used to call her that, but that was a long, long time ago. Even if he called her that because of Mu Yun, her heart still palpitated. She was silent. Mu Yun looked at one and then the other. pursing his lips. After little Mu Yun returned to his bedroom, Qin Amlin took a cigarette and put it in his hand. The child is very sensitive. Lianxiu, don't make him unhappy. She didn't say anything, but just sneered. I know you blame me. He looked at her. But you, Lianxiu, you never told me that you gave birth to a child. You made Mu Yun without a father for so long. He hadn't smoked, not because he didn't want to, but because Mu Yun was here. He didn't want his son to inhale secondhand smoke, so he had been restraining himself. He fell in love with the little guy the moment he saw him. Yi Lianxiu looked down. If you had known that I was pregnant, would you have let me give birth? He looked up and so did she. They looked into each other's eyes. He didn't reply, and she heard the sound of flowers blooming and wilting. So he laughed softly and said self-deprecatingly, I knew it would be like this. How much do you know about me? Qin Amlin's eyes were filled with pain. How do you know that I don't want him? Yi Lianxiu's pupil shrank. Qin Amlin slowly walked over and gently brought her into his arms. A warm breath enveloped her body, and in such a warm embrace, she actually felt like crying. Lianxiu, I think you know what to do. I don't want to hurt Mu Yun, he whispered in her ear. However, that gentle voice seemed to have sent her into a frozen valley. After he finished speaking, he let go of her. That touch of warmth also disappeared. Half an hour later, in his white sports car, Yi Lianxiu pursed her lips. Why must we go to the hospital where Lin Xingyuan is? He obviously did it on purpose. Qin Amlin slowly fastened the seat belt and said calmly, Mu Yun was originally examined by him, and I believe that Lin Xingyuan will be the best doctor for Mu Yun. He said it in a dignified manner, but Yi Lianxiu didn't believe his reason. Qin Amlin glanced at her again and started the car. I've already spoken to Lin Xingyuan on the phone. Chapter 13:23. What? Can't bear to part with him? His tone was a little strange. Yi Lianxiu didn't bother to say anything to him. She just hugged Mu Yun. Little Mu Yun looked at Qin Amlin in front of him, and then looked at his mother with a curious expression. Is Dad jealous of Uncle Lin? Yi Lianxiu didn't say anything. Qin Amlin was also stunned for a moment. After a long time, he smiled and said, Mu Yun is so smart. Yi Lianxiu glared at his back. Qin Amlin saw it in the rearview mirror. He met her eyes and smiled. It had to be said that Qin Amlin's white teeth were quite beautiful. Yi Lianxiu was even angrier. The car drove to the hospital where Lin Xingyuan was. The car stopped. Qin Amlin got out of the car first and picked up little Mu Yun. In fact, 7-year-old children usually left by themselves, but he was absent from little Mu Yun's growth for a long time, so he felt that it was okay to spoil him a little. However, Yi Lianxiu said in a low voice, You don't have to spoil him so much. Qin Amlin glanced at her and still held little Mu Yun. Are you unhappy? No. She didn't object anymore. It was useless to object. They went all the way to Lin Xingyuan's office on the 4th floor. Lin Xingyuan had already gone to work and had been waiting for a long time. When they went in, only Lin Xingyuan and a young nurse were talking. When they came in, Lin Xingyuan asked the young nurse to leave. Qin Amlin saw half a cigarette, but in the ashtray on Lin Xingyuan's desk. He pursed his lips almost imperceptibly, and then put Mu Yun on the examination table next to him. Dr. Lin, please check my son. He lowered his eyes and said, You should know his condition very well. Lin Xingyuan's eyes fell on Yi Lianxiu. After a while, he rested his eyes on little Mu Yun. From the beginning to the end, he did not look at Qin Amlin. He smiled lightly. Of course, when he was examining little Mu Yun, the little guy looked up at him with tears in his eyes and called out softly, Uncle Lin. Qin Amlin did not know how Lin Xingyuan felt at that time. He only knew that he wanted to cry. His son looked at Lin Xingyuan with an extremely trusting gaze. Lin Xingyuan had accompanied Yi Lianxiu and Mu Yun for so many years. He had even moved from the south to B City and brought her back to the south from B City. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. After Lin Xingyuan checked, he smiled faintly. Our Mu Yun seems to be a little stronger. Qin Amlin lowered his eyes and looked at his son. Mu Yun looked more like Lianxiu. He was familiar with his facial features, and he liked them. He couldn't help but reach out to stroke his little head, but his words were directed at Lin Xingyuan. Is there no way to cure it? He didn't mind being a blood bank, but the future was long. There would be times when he would be negligent or not by Mu Yun's side. Besides, such a painful process would affect Mu Yun's future. Mu Yun couldn't go to school like this, so he still hoped that he could get better soon. He was already thinking of handing King Entertainment over to Mu Yun in the future. This child was very smart. He liked him very much. Perhaps it was a little selfish. Because he and Chi-Chi didn't have sex, they might not have the chance to have children in this lifetime. So a ready-made heir was naturally the best. Lin Xingyuan glanced at Yi Liangqiu and then shook his head slowly. There's no way. When he grows up, this illness will naturally be cured. Chapter 13:24. Qin Amlin's fingers stroked his son's soft black hair, and he did not say another word. His heart ached a little. He brought little Mu Yun to have his blood drawn. Little Mu Yun stretched out his arm, which was full of needle marks. Some were new, some were from the past. His heart ached just by looking at them. Daddy, it doesn't hurt. A faint smile appeared on little Mu Yun's face. It was a beautiful smile, and it looked just like Yi Liangqiu. Qin Amlin thought of the time when Yi Liangqiu was filming a commercial film. It was a fight scene, and her back was mostly bruised. At that time, when they were living together, he asked her if it hurt. Yi Liangqiu was lying on her stomach with her face buried in the pillow, and she said that it didn't hurt. Silly girl. How could it not hurt? The corners of Qin Amlin's mouth curled up slightly, and his voice was also faint. Mu Yun, Daddy will accompany you in the future, okay? If it hurts, Daddy will hug you. The little boy's face flushed, and he shyly buried his face in his father's arms. Little Mu Yun was very distressed. Although his father did not know him in the past, he was very good to him. When he was receiving needles, his father would even hug him. But Uncle Lin was also very good to him for many years. Which one should he choose? It was difficult for him to choose, so it must be even more difficult for his mother. The two of them walked up the stairs to the 4th floor. Lin Xingyuan and Yi Liangqiu were not there. Qin Amlin asked the nurse to look after little Mu Yun, and he went outside to look for them. He could totally wait, but he could not wait. In front of the elevator, Yi Liangqiu and Lin Xingyuan stood face to face. Xingyuan, don't wait for me. She looked up at him. Lin Xingyuan's fingers touched her hair lightly, and he smiled bitterly. I can wait. Qin Amlin looked at them from afar and could not hear what she said. He only saw their gazes, and they were looking at each other affectionately. He had a feeling that he had been cheated. She had fallen in love with someone else. He had returned the ring to her, and this morning he had seen her wearing it again. In her heart, she loved Lin Xingyuan. This discovery made him feel indescribably uncomfortable. He told himself that it was because they had a child, so he wanted her to be clean and not belong to another man. He convinced himself that this was for Mu Yun's physical and mental health. In the end, he still walked over to her and said faintly, Liangqiu, it's time to go back. His tone was very light, but his heart was burning with jealousy, as if he had caught his cheating wife. Yi Liangqiu nodded and looked at Lin Xingyuan. Xingyuan, I'll be leaving first. Lin Xingyuan didn't say anything. He just pounded his hands into his pockets and stared at them. Yi Liangqiu, it's very uncomfortable, isn't it? Qin Amlin's hand suddenly grabbed her fingers, and he stared at her unfathomably. She also stopped and looked at him sideways. After a long time, she said faintly, if you do this, I will think that you are a jealous husband. Qin Amlin, don't do such things that will make me misunderstand. There will only be misunderstandings when there is hope, right? He said ambiguously. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips and didn't say anything. He went to carry little Mu Yun to the car, and after getting in the car and sitting down, he said, I will come to get the report in the afternoon. Yi Liangqiu didn't speak to him, and she didn't want to talk to him. Are you thinking about him? He looked at the rearview mirror as he drove, and his tone was unfriendly. Yi Liangqiu pursed her lips, and she couldn't bear it anymore. Qin Amlin, you said it yourself? Chapter 13:25. In fact, he was the one who had lost control. He knew that. In this silence, he gripped the steering wheel tightly and drove. Just then, the phone on the dashboard rang. He picked it up. The voice coming from the other side was muffled. Yi Lianqiu couldn't quite understand what he was saying. However, she could see that Qin Anlin's face had turned very ugly. He even glanced at her through the rearview mirror. After that, he hung up the phone. The atmosphere in the car seemed to be frozen. Yi Lianqiu's heart also fell to the bottom. She guessed that he knew something. However, he kept acting up. When the car arrived at the hotel, he still carried Mu Yun out of the car. When he looked at Mu Yun, his eyes were still warm. Only when he looked at her could she feel the bone-piercing coldness. Yi Lianqiu thought that she and he were indeed not a good couple. No matter what she did, she couldn't enter his eyes. When they arrived at the hotel, they had lunch in the VIP area on the second floor. He carried Mu Yun back to the room and coaxed the child to sleep. Yi Lianqiu had to admit that he was very good to Mu Yun. When he returned to the master bedroom, she stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window and looked at him. Her voice was a little indifferent. Qin Anlin, if you have anything to say, just say it. Why don't we start from the 100 million that Tang Yu gave you? Qin Anlin closed the door, took off his coat, and threw it on the sofa. When he did all this, his eyes were locked on her. Yi Lianqiu pursed her lips and looked at him. After a while, she said, "That's not my intention." "Then what is?" He looked at her. "Having 2 Rh-negative blood banks? It's been 7 years, and you haven't said anything about it. But now you're telling me that you have a child. Yi Lianqiu, is this the deal between you and Tang Yu?" "Yes." She looked at him. 100 million, 100 million, and I'll betray you." She looked straight at him and didn't flinch. There was a touch of blood in Qin Anlin's eyes. He walked towards her step by step and finally stood in front of her. He reached out and pinched her cheek. "Have you thought about Mu Yun? For the sake of 100 million, you let Mu Yun bear so much?" Yi Lianqiu chuckled. She laughed so hard that tears rolled down her cheeks. "Yes, I did it for money. For money, I don't even care about my own son." His face turned ashen. "Yi Lianqiu, even if you say that you did it for yourself and your son, it's still better than doing it for money." He was furious. He reached out and pulled her into his arms. His dark eyes locked onto hers. "You heartless woman." "Yes, I don't have a heart." She looked at him. "Qin Anlin, how much better are you than me?" She looked him in the eye without flinching, and he was furious enough to burn her. Finally, when his anger reached a certain level, he lost control and tore off her clothes. The sound of tearing was accompanied by her broken scream. She was thrown onto the bed forcefully. He pressed her down hard. His body was pressed against hers, and his face was pressed against hers. His eyes were so close. It was close enough to make her tremble. Suddenly, he bit her lips. She felt the pain and wanted to break free. His fingers quickly pinched her cheek, and she was forced to open her lips. He had taken her inside and out, completely and utterly. Her clothes fell on the floor one by one, and her necklace was thrown out of the window. She screamed, struggled, cried, but she couldn't stop him. Every time she struggled, he treated her more violently. Chapter 13:26. Yi Lianqiu, does it hurt? He looked at the tears at the corner of her eyes, lowered his head and kissed her, torturing her even more wantonly. "Yi Lianqiu, because I'm in so much pain, because even if I hate you for lying to me, I can't give up on Mu Yun." In this hopeless entanglement, Qin Anlin was forced to make a choice. He knew what the outcome would be, but he couldn't choose it. In the face of feelings and kinship, he would choose kinship. No matter how much love and hatred there was between him and Yi Lianqiu, Mu Yun was innocent. He couldn't give up on Mu Yun in this long torture. She was in pain, and he was in pain. He could even feel that she had never had any other man accept him. She was almost as young as the previous 2 times, because her expression looked like there was only pain and no joy. He, on the other hand, did not want her to be happy. Thus, in this game that lasted for 6 hours, he successfully made her break down in pain and made her beg in his arms. His body, which had been empty for more than 2 years, was greatly satisfied, but his heart was even emptier. He was lost. He didn't want to love her, but he fell in love with her body. When everything calmed down, he turned to the side, leaned against the headboard, took out a cigarette, lit it, and slowly took a puff. After a while, he lowered his head and looked at her. Yi Lianxio was lying on her stomach, and her back was full of the marks he made. They were green and purple, and it was a little frightening. He knew how hard he had hit her, and he knew how crazy he was. Not only her back, but even that part of her body had been injured by him. "Can you still get up?" His voice was a little hoarse. He also despised himself in his heart. He was like a blind male dog. He had seen countless people in the past, but now he didn't want to get up. Yi Lianxio moved slightly and sucked in a breath of air. "Hurt!" He finished the cigarette in his hand and put it out. Then, he sat up and gently flipped her over, looking at her body. Even he was a little shocked by his own rudeness. He had never been so rude to a woman before. However, her messy beauty had also reached the pinnacle. He didn't even want to let her go. In the end, reason won over Yu Wang. His fingers touched her gently, and she trembled subconsciously. "Qin Anlin, let me see if you were hurt." His voice was a little tense. Then he pressed her with one hand and checked her body firmly with the other. At this time, it was already evening, and the light was dim. He raised his hand and turned on the light. The light was bright, of her face, and she felt ashamed. "I'm fine." But he ignored her and went over to check her body. When she opened her eyes, she saw a pair of bottomless eyes. Of his eyes. Their gazes met for a long. Yi Lianxio was stunned. He glared at him. "Qin Anlin, do you still have any shame?" "Of course. You've already given birth to a child." He didn't hang up the phone, but looked at her with a sneer. She was so angry that she snatched the phone from him. "Also, bring a box of after-the-fact medicine." The receptionist of the hotel was stunned. This couple was really rough. Chapter 1327. The receptionist trembled as she walked over. It was the host who opened the door. He only had a small towel around his waist. His figure was really great. His six-pack abs were evenly distributed, and it didn't make people feel like they were tangled. Instead, it was just right. The receptionist swallowed hard and handed over the ointment, an ointment in her hands. "Sir, you've ordered room service." Qin Anlin looked at her. He only took the ointment, but didn't take the ointment. He said coldly, "Send me 10 boxes of T-shirts." The receptionist was so scared that she peed. 10 boxes? Send them over immediately." "Oh yes, I want Cinemoto Platinum 001, the super thin kind," he said lightly. It was as natural as talking about the weather when he said such shameful words. The receptionist secretly cursed the scumbag in her heart, but she still had a smile on her face. "Yes, Mr. Qin." Qin Anlin didn't look at her again and closed the door. The door almost hit the pretty receptionist's nose. She stood there for a long time and said angrily, "So what if you have money? If you have the guts, throw money at me." Inside the door, Qin Anlin walked into the master bedroom with the ointment. Yi Lianxio was no longer on the bed. He heard the sound of water in the bathroom, so he walked over slowly. She was taking a bath. Qin Anlin leaned against the door and watched for a while before he walked in. He sat on the edge of the bathtub and handed the ointment to her. "Apply it yourself." Yi Lianxio took it, but didn't apply it. Instead, she splashed the water over her body. He had to admit that this was the most beautiful scene he had ever seen. She was slender and fair, and her body was well-proportioned. Every inch of her was perfect. After a long time, she looked up at him. "Don't you hate me? Don't you hate me? You don't need to care about me like this." He stared at her body and said slowly, "Yi Lianxio, I've asked the receptionist to prepare 10 boxes of T-shirts, so I advise you to apply some ointment." "You're shameless." She covered her body and glared at him. However, he grabbed her hand and raised it up high. He squinted at her with his black eyes, and a hint of coldness appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Yi Lianxio, didn't you expect such an outcome? Why did we break up in the first place? Isn't it because we can't control ourselves from sleeping with each other?" When he finished speaking, she froze. He, too, was dumbfounded. After a long time, he finally digested his own words with great difficulty. Perhaps the words spoken in anger were more instinctive. They stared at each other for a long time before he said coldly, "Yi Liangxiu, do you think we won't have sex when we're together?" "I can't," she said firmly. He chuckled. "But I can't do it." She stood up from the water without the slightest intention of covering herself. She slowly wiped her body clean with a towel and applied some medicine. Her movements were slow, graceful, and pleasing to the eye. Qin Amlin had seen many women act coquettishly and ask for benefits after sex, or cry and say that it was their first time. But Yi Liangxiu had always been different. His gaze was a little hot as he looked at her. "Qin Amlin, what do you think is the most important thing in marriage?" She looked down and asked softly. He pursed his lips. "Emotions." Chapter 13:28. He was speechless. "Because you didn't have sex." Yi Liangxiu smiled. "A marriage without sex is an incomplete marriage." "Qin Amlin, how much longer are you going to lie to yourself?" "Yi Liangxiu, don't get involved in my life," he said unhappily. "Don't think that." Before he could finish, she interrupted coldly. "Don't think that just because I climbed into your bed, you can be spoiled, right?" She smiled coldly. "Qin Amlin, you overestimate yourself." She walked into the bedroom slowly, and he actually followed her. Yi Liangxiu took out a box of pills from the bedside table. It was the morning after pill. She swallowed one, drank some water, and ate it. She didn't force herself during the whole process. Qin Amlin's heart tightened. "You don't want to give birth to my child just like that?" "I'm scared, Qin Amlin." Her voice was a little tired. "You're not the only victim." She was pregnant with his child for 4 months and had to endure the pain while filming. She had to finish filming before she could safely give birth to the child. She knew that if she didn't leave behind a few works, it would be impossible for her to make a comeback in the future. King Entertainment wouldn't value her. He had no idea how much she had sacrificed for her success and how much pain she had to go through. Perhaps he did like her, but it was very, very shallow, and his love was very selfish. He dominated everything and didn't allow her to have her own thoughts. When he was happy, she was his little Liangxiu, his pillow and sleeping pill. When he was done with her, he wouldn't be so happy. He could tell her to leave and say that they could never be together. After all these years, when had she ever had such extravagant hopes? Not even once. She looked at him with a strange gaze. Qin Amlin suddenly said, "Why did you come back to me if you liked him?" "Because I didn't have a choice." She threw him a document. "Qin Amlin, go ask your mother what she did to me. Go ask her why she had a heart attack a year ago. Go ask her if she already knew about Mu Yun's existence." Qin Amlin was stunned. He couldn't believe it. His mother knew of Mu Yun's existence? "Why didn't she tell me?" His voice was tense. Yi Liangxiu looked into his eyes and smiled faintly. Her voice was also faint. "Because Mu Yun is a sick child. It's not worth her telling you." "Is that why you told her that I got married in New York?" He closed his eyes. She did not answer directly but said something else. "Qin Amlin, when your mother was hospitalized, Mu Yun was also hospitalized. The reason was that your mother took Mu Yun away by force, causing Mu Yun to be injured." Qin Amlin looked at her for a long time before saying bitterly, "You hate me, don't you?" "A little bit," she said bluntly and looked into his eyes. "Qin Amlin, we're even?" He looked at the unfamiliarity in her eyes. Looking at those emotionless eyes, he suddenly missed her in the past. He missed her soft appearance in his condominium. At this moment, Qin Amlin realized that the old Yi Liangxiu was gone. He had driven her away himself. His voice was almost trembling. "Do you love him?" "I like him," she answered him seriously. She answered him very seriously. There were some words that she had never said to Lin Xingyuan before. "If you didn't appear, I think I would have married him and lived my life peacefully." Chapter 13:29. She stood at such a high position. Was she willing to give up everything? Back then, he had only put her on the shelf to dampen her spirit. He had never thought that she would give up. She was a natural superstar, and she should stand in the most dazzling place. Yi Liangxiu's gaze became a little fanatical. He didn't understand her. but she knew him very well. She smiled and said, "Qin Anlin, do you think that's important to me?" "I think that's where you should stand," he said calmly. She had no idea how dazzling she was on the big screen. He had watched countless of her films, and he had a collection of them, as well as every single one of her endorsements. Yi Lianxiu raised her head, and tears flowed down her cheeks. She tilted her head and looked at him. "What do I want fame and fortune for? That's never what I want." She almost growled out the last sentence. He was stunned. She wiped her tears and said, "You won't understand." To her, the entertainment industry was just for survival. When there was no pressure to survive, she didn't want to be in such a colorful industry because the more prosperous it was, the lonelier she would be. She didn't love Lin Xingyuan, but she liked him. She felt that she would be happy with him. "Qin Anlin, you don't need to be on guard against me. You don't need to worry that I will interfere with your relationship, because I'm not interested." She smiled bitterly. "If your heart dies, you won't be able to live." Her love had been destroyed that year. He had made her take morning-after pills, and he had asked her to leave. He didn't want her. Qin Anlin stared fixedly at her. At this moment, the doorbell rang. He looked at her and went to open the door. It was the receptionist who had brought the morning-after pills. "Mr. Qin, the Compendium Platinum 001 is 10 boxes. The receptionist smiled, but she was thinking, "Use it. I won't kill you." Qin Anlin reached out and took it, then closed the door expressionlessly. The receptionist's nose was almost smashed again. Her face darkened. "So what if you're rich?" Qin Anlin took the 10 boxes and threw them on the bedside table. Yi Lianxiu, on the other hand, pretended that she didn't see anything. Qin Anlin stood in front of the French window and smoked for a long time before he said softly, "Yi Lianxiu, have you ever liked me?" She looked at his back and smiled. "I don't like it anymore." "You're lying." He slowly turned his head and looked at her. "If you don't like it, why did you still sleep with me?" "Can't I have other motives?" she asked. And he didn't say a word. Yi Lianxiu slowly lay down on the bed and said, "Qin Anlin, I'm just an ordinary person. Just treat it as a physiological need. Just treat it as a play." She said it casually, but he was burning with anger. "Playing along? If it weren't for me, would you have found someone else if you had a physical need?" After he said that, he took a long drag on his cigarette. Yi Lianxiu chuckled. "Probably, I would." His body froze. "Yi Lianxiu, how dare you?" "Qin Anlin, if I get married one day, do you think I'll be like you, in an immoral marriage? Do you think that kind of marriage is normal?" She said mockingly, deliberately provoking him and rubbing salt in his wound. Qin Anlin narrowed his eyes, but he really didn't seem to be able to do anything to her. Just then his phone rang. Chapter 1330. Yi Lianxiu's gaze fell on his face. After a long while she smiled. Qin Anlin felt a stab of pain in his heart. He felt that her gaze was mocking him. However, he didn't have time. After taking a look at her, he started to put on his clothes. Yi Lianxiu was a little tired. She lay flat and closed her eyes. She didn't look at him the whole time. When Qin Anlin left, his gaze was a little complicated. He looked at her as if she was asleep. But in the end, he still left. Before he left, he went to see Mu Yun. He ruffled his hair and asked him to take care of his mother. Mu Yun sat on the sofa. "What's wrong with Mommy?" Qin Anlin paused for a moment. "Mommy is a little tired." Little Mu Yun jumped off the sofa and walked to the door of the master bedroom. He saw the mess in the room. He was a precocious child. He knew that Mommy had been bullied by Daddy. He raised his head and looked at Qin Anlin. His expression was a little uneasy. "Will Daddy come back?" Qin Anlin's heart softened. This child was truly very sensible and also very sensitive. He squatted down and hugged Mu Yun. He said patiently, "He will definitely come back. Daddy will come back tonight." Little Mu Yun's little arms wrapped around his neck and hugged him tightly. His slightly cold face was pressed against Qin Anlin's face. He said softly, "Will Daddy not want Mommy anymore?" Qin Anlin's body trembled. He raised his son's little face and looked at him seriously. A 7-year-old child knew far more than they could imagine. He had struggled with it before. At this moment, when little Mu Yun asked him this question, he already had an answer in his heart. so he rubbed the little boy's little head. Of course not. The little person in his arms hugged him even tighter. Later, he even kissed him on the face. After the kiss, little Muyun's face was slightly red. He refused to let Qin Anlin see it. He hugged him and said shyly, "Daddy, I've only kissed you." The underlying meaning was that he hadn't even kissed Uncle Lin before. Qin Anlin's heart was instantly filled with sweetness and indescribable comfort. This little girl was as awkward as Yi Liangxiu, but she was quite cute. At this moment, he didn't even want to go to B City anymore. He might as well just stay. To help others, to help oneself. However, he was always worried about Chi-Chi. She had no money with her. Would something happen to her? Reaching out, he plucked the little guy from his arms and patted him. "Daddy will be back soon." Little Mu Yun nodded lightly, with tears in his eyes. His little appearance melted Qin Anlin's heart. Yi Liangxiu doesn't know how to act coquettishly, but Yi Muyun's ability to do so explosively makes him able to grab Qin Anlin at any time. He patted his son's head again before leaving. The door closed. Yi Muyun then walked into the bedroom. The little boy carefully picked up his mother's clothes one by one and folded them, although they were a little tattered. Sigh. He was so sensible. He felt worried for the adults. Yi Liangxiu was not asleep. Her voice was very soft. "Muyun, has he left?" Little Mu Yun climbed onto the bed and lay beside his mother, hugging her with his little hands. That soft little hand made people feel very comfortable. There was a kind of warm feeling. The little boy raised his head. "Daddy." Yi Liangxiu sometimes had a headache with his son. He was so precocious that he didn't seem like a 7-year-old child. He was intelligent enough to communicate with adults. Although she was unwilling, she still nodded. Chapter 1331. Yi Liangxiu couldn't help but ask, "Muyun, if Mommy leaves Daddy one day." Xiao Muyun raised her little face and looked at her, staring straight at her. Yi Liangxiu couldn't ask anymore. She pursed her lips and said, "Forget it, Mommy won't ask anymore." Little Muyun lay back down and patted her back. He coaxed her like an adult. "Mommy, go to sleep. I'll watch Mommy sleep." Yi Liangxiu found it funny, but she felt an indescribable warmth in her heart. After a while, she smiled gently and said, "Our Mu Yun is a warm little boy." Little Mu Yun's face was slightly red. He wasn't warm. He was cold to everyone. He only wanted to protect his mommy. However, the iceberg and warm little boy didn't expect that he would meet his little yellow bun later on. As long as he looked at that little yellow bun, his heart would melt and he would be willing to give her everything she liked. Yi Liangxiu fell asleep. She was in a deep sleep, and Yi Muyun kept watching the time. At 9 o'clock in the evening, he secretly picked up his mommy's phone and sent a message to Daddy. "Muyun isn't feeling well. Come back soon. Liangxiu." After the little boy sent the message, he waited for a reply. He was a little hungry, so he found some food and fell asleep next to Yi Liangxiu. Meanwhile, in B City, Qin Anlin found Pei Chi-Chi on the streets of B City. Originally, he was going to take her to the apartment before leaving. However, he received a message. He lowered his head and looked at the message for a long time. When he looked up at Pei Chi-Chi again, his gaze was a little complicated. After a long time, he looked at Kaim and said calmly, "Kaim, take Chi-Chi to the apartment and call me when she arrives." Kaim's body trembled, and he subconsciously looked at Qin Anlin's phone. He probably realized something, but he couldn't believe that President Qin would really give up Pei Chi-Chi for Yi Liangxiu. Startled for a moment, he finally nodded. "I will." Qin Anlin walked slowly to Pei Chi-Chi. Her long hair was a little messy because of the night wind. He reached out, straightened her hair, and pressed it. At this time, Pei Chi-Chi also saw the hickey on his neck. She stared straight at him. His voice was a little hoarse. Chi-Chi stopped looking. He loosened his grip in embarrassment. "Give me a call when you get to the apartment. Be careful and don't run around." He paused for a moment before saying, "I'll be back soon." Pei Chi-Chi looked up at him. Her eyes were especially dazzling in the dark. He didn't dare to look at them. He looked down. "Get in the car. I'll watch you leave." Pei Chi-Chi nodded and took 2 steps back. They looked at each other in the night wind. Actually, they both knew that this was probably the last time they would be so close to each other. He had a woman, and she had also met a man who made her lose control. She didn't want to think about her past with Anlin, because he had been her family for the past 2 years. She didn't want to add all those unbearable things between them. She wanted him to be fine, and so did she. "I'm fine, Anlin." She looked at him and smiled under the moonlight. "I'm fine." She even spun around on the spot, looking relaxed and happy. Cheen Anlin's gaze deepened. "Chi-Chi, do you know that the happier you are, the less I'm in your heart?" Chapter 1332. Perhaps this was the main reason why they had never been able to be together. She didn't want to give it to him. It wasn't that she couldn't give it to him, but even though she had lost her memory, she still had that person in her heart. As long as she saw that person, everything would be released. She also had him in her heart, just the kind of family. He looked at her and sadly realized that he had actually given up. But he didn't have the courage to tell her. He stood in the night and watched her get into the car. His fingers clenched and he held his phone tightly. On it was the reason why he had to give up on Pei Chi-Chi, and it also contained the last trace of softness in his heart. The car slowly drove past in front of him. His gaze was a little cold as he looked at the back of the car and pursed his lips. When the car was out of sight, he got into the car and sat in the back seat. He closed his eyes slightly. To the airport, the driver, Old Zhang, was also an old member of the Qin family. He hesitated for a moment. "Young master, do you want to go back and see old madams?" Qin Anlin slowly opened his eyes and looked at Old Zhang. "No need." To the airport, Old Zhang shook his head and sighed in his heart. There was something he wanted to say, but in the end, he didn't say anything. When the car arrived at the airport, Qin Anlin's private plane was already ready. In less than 2 hours, they arrived at H City. Sitting in the car and looking at the bustling night view of H City, his heart was in turmoil. He had given up on Pei Chi-Chi, King Entertainment, and his mother. Was it really just for Muyin? In such a quiet moment, he was willing to admit to himself that it wasn't like that. Muyun's illness wasn't acute, and he had clearly found out that Yi Liangxiu had 2 active blood banks. He really didn't need to be by Muyun's side all the time. So, who was he in such a hurry to return to H City for? Perhaps he knew it in his heart, but he wasn't willing to admit it to himself. He wasn't willing to admit that a relationship that he had given up was engraved in his heart. The black limousine stopped at the entrance of the 5-star hotel. Qin Anlin opened the door and got out. He was dressed in black, looking a little bleak in the middle of the night. The phone in his hand rang. He took it. It was a call from Kime. "President Qin, Miss Pei is missing again." There was a hint of uneasiness in Kime's voice. "But don't worry, President Qin. I will find Miss Pei." Qin Anlin raised his head and looked at the lights on the street. His lips twitched slightly. It was expected. Since he didn't say anything, Kime felt even more uneasy and didn't dare to make a sound. After a long time, Qin Anlin said faintly and hung up the phone. Perhaps what should come could not be stopped, and what did not belong to him would never belong to him. He slowly walked inside, but in the lobby of the hotel, he met an unexpected person. "Mom!" Qin Anlin frowned slightly as he looked at the lady sitting on the sofa and Crispy Sleeve. Crispy Sleeve nodded at Qin Anlin, then helped Lady Qin up. "Old Madam has just arrived too." She heard that young master had returned to B City and was wondering if she had missed him. "I didn't expect young master to return." Qin Anlin looked at his mother, then looked around and said calmly, "Did you get a room?" Crispy Sleeve shook her head, her gaze meaningful. Qin Anlin saw the signal in her eyes and knew what was going on. Thus, he carried his luggage and asked for a suite from the front desk. Naturally, he wouldn't be on the same floor as Yi Liangxiu. In response, Lady Qin said slowly, "Are you afraid that I'll make things difficult for her?" Chapter 1333. Lady Qin looked at her son and was furious. However, she didn't want to lose face outside, so she snorted. "You knew that I would be angry?" Qin Anlin smiled and didn't reply. Soft Sleeve tried to smooth things over. "How long has it been since we last met? Mother and son, you two are so sarcastic. It's a joke. Are you an outsider?" Lady Qin's tone wasn't very good. Soft Sleeve knew that she was in a bad mood, so she didn't mind. She just looked at Sheen Anlin again. This old lady has to be coaxed. After going to the suite, Soft Sleeve went to tidy up. Madam Sheen and Sheen Anlin sat in the study. It had been a long time since they had appeared in the study together in such a formal manner. Lady Sheen sat upright and took a sip of the tea that Sheen Anlin handed over. Then, she said lightly, "Why? You went to be city to comfort the little vixen, and now you're back to look for the vixen?" Women who were beautiful and could make her son fall head over heels for her were all vixens. As for that Pei Chi-Chi, she didn't see her because she knew that it wouldn't be long. Her son had lived with her for so long, but he didn't even touch her. There was nothing to be afraid of. On the other hand, this Yi Lianxiu was very capable. Not only did she secretly give birth to Anlin's child, but she could also make Anlin let go of Pei Chi-Chi. Lady Qin couldn't accept a woman like Yi Lianxiu. She couldn't in the past, and she definitely couldn't now. Such a woman was too scheming. No one in the Qin family would be able to control her. After hearing her words, Qin Anlin smiled bitterly. "Mom, your heart aches." Lady Qin sneered. "Let me ask you, is the one in B City or the one here in your heart?" Qin Anlin didn't think for too long and said slowly, "Mom, I have a son. Don't use your son as an excuse." Lady Qin's voice was a little stern. "Anlin, you know that our Qin family has run King Entertainment for so long, and it's an unwritten rule that we don't marry our own female artists. You used to know when to advance and when to retreat. Why can't you tell the difference now?" Qin Anlin sat down slowly and looked straight at his mother. "So, what do you want me to do? Don't want Muyin? Should he just pretend that he didn't have a son? Really?" Lady Qin looked at Qin Anlin. "What do you think? What can a sick child do?" "Mom, you're too cruel." Qin Anlin wiped his face. When he looked at Lady Qin again, his eyes were firm. "I will not abandon Mu Yun. He is my flesh and blood, my child." Lady Qin was furious. Yi Lianxiu gave birth to him with ulterior motives. She used him as a tool to threaten you into marrying her. "She won't," Qin Anlin blurted out. Lady Qin was also a little cold. "She won't tell you that you have a son 7 years later?" "Anlin, you didn't believe in women for a long time, did you?" Mrs. Qin closed her eyes and said, "Love is the most important thing. Think about how your father treated me and my mother back then." Qin Anlin clenched his fists. "He abandoned us and ran away with another woman." Lady Qin's voice had a touch of sternness. "He comes from a small family, so he's never familiar with us. Have you forgotten that he ran away with all the company's money? Have you forgotten that I was managing a company that was about to close down and struggling? Of course, that heartless man was also dead. Liang Xiu and he are different," Qin Anlin said with difficulty. Chapter 1334. Qin Anlin looked at his mother, his heart a little cold. "Mom, you already knew about Mu Yun's existence a year ago, didn't you?" Lady Qin's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't show it on her face. She only asked casually, "Did she tell you? Yes or no?" Qin Anlin's tone was a little unyielding. Lady Qin was so angry that she almost fainted. At this moment, Soft Sleeve came over and tried to calm him down. "No matter how angry young master is, you have to think about old madam's health." Qin Anlin pursed his lips slightly. After a long time, he said, "Mom, let's not talk about this. I'll get someone to send you back tomorrow." Lady Qin caught her breath and glared at her son angrily. "And then watch you and her fly away together? Anlin, are you trying to anger me to death?" Qin Anlin was silent for a long time before he asked, "Mom, do you love me?" "Of course." Lady Qin's tone softened, and there was some warmth in her eyes. Qin Anlin looked at his mother and said softly, "I love Muyin too. I love my child." Lady Qin knew that she had been tricked. Her face darkened, and she didn't say anything. Soft Sleeve looked at one and then at the other and laughed. "Look at the two of you. You're like children throwing a tantrum. I'll go make a cup of tea. You can drink it slowly and quarrel slowly." Soft Sleeve had been by Lady Qin's side for a long time. Lady Qin could hear the teasing tone in her words. Of course, she also reminded her, so she became much more sober. Her son was all grown up. Naturally, she couldn't go against him. If she forced him into a corner and Amlin left King Entertainment behind, she couldn't possibly let this old woman continue to manage the company. Lady Cheen rejected it from the bottom of her heart. She still wanted to enjoy a few more years of happiness. Thinking of this, her expression also softened. She looked at her son and said, "Forget it. You go back first. As for me and Qingxiu, once we get sick of staying in H City, we'll naturally go back." Qin Amlin didn't leave immediately. He waited until Crispy Sleeve brewed the best tea and drank it with Lady Qin before leaving. He didn't blame Lady Qin for what happened to Mu Yun. He wasn't that irrational. At the end of the day, it was his own fault. His mother had her own standpoint. He didn't agree with her, but he had no right to blame her. However, when he went out, his heart was heavy. When he returned to the presidential suite on the top floor, he opened the door. The suite was dark. He shook his head and turned on the lights. It was quiet and there was no sound at all. He walked towards the master bedroom. His footsteps were very light, and he did not wake up the man and woman sleeping on the bed when he walked in. Yi Lianxiu was sleeping with her body curled up. Mu Yun was lying on her back like a weak animal. They were sleeping so soundly that he did not wake them even when he turned on the light. At this time, it was almost midnight. His whole body was exhausted, and his heart was full of sorrow. He had given up 2 years of persistence just for this scene, and he had given up so easily. He walked in slowly and sat on the bed dejectedly. He reached out to stroke little Mu Yun's hair. The little guy was like a newborn calf, sending his head into his big palm. His heart couldn't help but soften. Suddenly, his gaze met Yi Lianxiu's. She had already woken up and was looking at him with her eyes wide open. Qin Amlin's voice was a little hoarse. "Slept for half a day." She grunted, her voice even more hoarse than his. He looked at her deeply for a while before taking off his jacket and opening the collar of his shirt. Chapter 1335. Qin Amlin paused and looked at her. Afraid? She didn't say anything. His lips curled into a cold smile. "Yi Lianxiu, I thought you weren't afraid of anything." She sat up slowly, looked down at little Mu Yun, and covered him with the quilt. "Is this how you usually take care of children?" Qin Amlin frowned. His tone was not pleasant, but his voice was soft. Yi Lianxiu looked at him, got out of bed, put on a robe, and tied the belt. "Your body seems to be better." He smiled and followed her out. "I'm a little hungry. Make me a midnight snack." She looked at him, didn't say anything, and went to the kitchen. She had lived here for a long time, and the kitchen utensils were complete, including fresh ingredients every day. She opened the fridge and took out a chicken breast, a few fresh shiitake mushrooms, and a small handful of vegetables. Qin Amlin frowned when he smelled it. "I don't eat shredded chicken noodles." He hated shredded chicken noodles the most, because Tang Yu loved to eat it, and because Pei Chi-Chi loved to cook it. He went from simply disliking it to hating it. Yi Lianxiu filled a bowl with it, brought it to the dining table, and placed it in front of her. Then, she began to eat in front of him. Qin Amlin was a little angry. "I'm hungry. I thought you didn't eat shredded chicken noodles?" Her voice was very indifferent, and she glanced at him. "I like it now." He was cheeky. In fact, it smelled quite good. Yi Lianxiu blew on it, put the fat shiitake into her mouth, and said slowly after eating, "A man who goes to another woman is not qualified to make me cook." Lin Xingyuan is, isn't he? He was full of anger. Yi Lianxiu put down her chopsticks. "If you mention him again, get out of here." "Heartache." He looked at her mockingly. Yi Lianxiu stared at him for a while and suddenly said, "Yes, my heart hurts. However, it shouldn't be comparable to the pain you'll feel in B City today." He was a little angry. She was really not afraid of him at all. He stretched out his long arm and snatched the bowl from her hand. He lowered his head and took 2 bites from her bowl and chopsticks. He moved so quickly that it took her a while to react. "Qin Amlin, is it dirty?" As soon as he finished speaking, he let go of her hand and looked up at her with an unfathomable gaze. After a long time, he said slowly and shamelessly, "Don't talk about your saliva. I've even eaten yours before." Yi Lianxiu blushed and glared at him. "You've never seen it before?" Still don't believe me? Do you want to try again? His voice was very cold, and he spoke the most shameless words with a straight face. Yi Lianqiu ignored him and turned around to get another bowl of shredded chicken noodles. It was more seasoned than the previous bowl, and it was even more tempting. However, as soon as she served it, it was taken away by a certain shameless man. Then the bowl that they had both eaten was returned to her. Qin Anlin, can you be any more shameless? She pursed her lips. She only complained and did not snatch it. Whoever tried to snatch it would be childish. Qin Anlin leaned against the back of the chair, his hands in front of him, and looked at the bowl with dissatisfaction. Help me remove the vegetables. I'm not your mother. She lowered her head and ate her noodles. Chapter 1336. After a while, he said in a hoarse voice, I don't like to eat vegetables. Yi Lianqiu put down her chopsticks and glared at him. It was a habit she hated because Muyin didn't like to eat them. Hurry up and help me pick them out. He looked at her with a condescending look. Yi Lianqiu finally moved, but she didn't help him pick them out. Instead, she picked all the vegetables in her bowl and put them in his bowl. Didn't he not like to eat them? Then eat as much as you want. She didn't know that her action was almost childish, but it was a little cute in his eyes, especially after the quarrel with his mother. Qin Anlin was in a bad mood and had been depressed, but now he was much happier. He looked at her and smiled. Finally, he reached out his chopsticks. For the first time, a person who had never eaten vegetables finished all the vegetables in his bowl. He frowned, just like Crayon Shinchan. It was a little ugly, but it was cute. Yi Lianqiu picked the noodles and admired his look. She couldn't help smiling. Although it was just a little he caught it, he was stunned. How long had it been since he saw her smile? Except on the big screen, he could only see her smile in his dreams. He looked straight at her smile, and she probably felt his gaze. Her smile froze on her lips, and she lowered her head to eat the noodles. Everything was silent again. The atmosphere was a little stiff. He looked at her for a while and finally lowered his head to eat his noodles. He didn't like chicken shredded noodles, but he could eat it now. It was probably because he was hungry. When Yi Lianqiu was cleaning the bowl, his fingers touched her hand. Let me do it. She looked up into his eyes. At the same time, her hand trembled, so did he. He hesitated to move his hand away, but in the end, he didn't. At the same time, they thought of the time when they were in the apartment. Sometimes, after they finished eating, she actually dared to let him do the dishes. Now, he was used to it. They looked at each other for a long time. Yi Lianqiu said softly, No need. She broke away from his hand and began to clean up the dishes. Then, she washed them in the sink. She did all this elegantly and was very different from the young girl who was busy in the kitchen. Qin Anlin looked at her back and suddenly asked, Lianqiu, can't you go back? Her back stiffened. Then, she washed her hands for about 5 minutes before picking up a napkin to dry her hands. Her voice drifted over slowly. You didn't cherish the past, so why should I be reluctant to part with it? She turned her head and looked straight at him. Qin Anlin, I wanted to give birth to this child myself. It has nothing to do with you. If it weren't for your mother dealing with Xingyuan, I wouldn't have let Mu Yin appear in front of you. Are you showing your cards now? He frowned and looked at her. You think you've achieved your goal, so you're done using me, right? He walked forward slowly, step by step, trapping her by the sink. His voice was a little gloomy. Do you think you've completed Tang Yu's task? It's none of your business. She gritted her teeth. It's not good for a woman to be so stubborn, he said coldly. Yi Lianqiu, do you dare to say that you don't like me? If you don't like me, why are you still willing to sleep with me? He pinched her chin and looked from her eyebrows to her nose, and then to her lips. Chapter 1337. He saw the ring on her neck again. It was eye-catching and glaring. His fingers paused, and his voice was cold. Did you go down to look for it? Yes. She didn't hide it. The cleaner found it and returned it to her. He looked at her clothes and suddenly smirked. I thought you couldn't move your legs. Turns out you still have strength. Qin Anlin, you can be more shameless. She was embarrassed and wanted to slap his handsome face. He caught her hand and held her wrist with his strong fingers. You have to change this bad habit. She glared at him. I don't have to change for you. He looked at her for a long time. Suddenly, he leaned over and kissed her lips. He saw that she wanted to struggle, so he quickly pinned her hands behind her back. She was leaning against the sink, and her body moved forward as if she was sending herself to him. Yi Lianqiu was extremely embarrassed. What are you trying to do? He leaned against her and let go of her hands. Yi Lianqiu, you can hit me as much as you want now, but I can't guarantee the consequences. She leaned back and stared at him in surprise, but she still tried to slap him. It was a light slap. Qin Anlin glared at her. You have guts. With that, he leaned forward and kissed her lips. He tasted the shiitake mushroom, and she tasted the faint taste of tobacco in his mouth. She was shocked and immediately reached out to hit him. But the harder she hit, the harder he kissed. Their lips and teeth intertwined. He was so hot that Yi Lianqiu felt that a layer of her lips had been rubbed off. After a long time, he finally let go of her lips and looked at her deeply. She had responded just now. Both of them were panting a little, especially her lips, which were glistening. It was very embarrassing. She instinctively licked it. He looked at it, and his eyes deepened. His Adam's apple unconsciously moved a little. Then he moved closer, his face very close to hers, and his voice was extremely hoarse. I'll kiss you every time you hit me. Yi Lianqiu hit his handsome face again, but his face was like an iron wall. Even after being hit, it didn't move at all. He directly pressed his lips against hers, making everything that had been in his mind come true. His lips moved downwards and he bit down on her neck. She almost jumped up in shock. Then, she tilted her head and bit his neck. Qin Anlin raised his eyes slightly, looked at her, and then let go. When he let go, she let go too. However, he did not leave her neck. Instead, he slowly sucked out a horrifying kiss mark. It was green and purple. After a long time, he loosened his lips and said in a hoarse voice, "This is a mark." Yi Lianqiu was stunned and looked at him. Qin Anlin tilted his head and looked at her. Again? She ignored him and directly pushed him away. You're crazy. Although she was scolding him, her ears turned red. Qin Anlin took 2 steps back, turned around, and walked into the living room. Yi Lianqiu followed behind him. Where's my necklace? He suddenly turned around and stared at her, staring straight at her. Her heart was beating wildly, but she forced herself to look at him. I threw it away, he said as he walked towards the bathroom. Yi Lianqiu hurriedly followed behind him. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, and she fell straight onto his back. Chapter 1338. You throw yourself into my arms and miss someone else at the same time. His voice was cold. Yi Lianqiu, you are really promising. She stood up straight and stretched out her hand. Give it back to me. He lowered his eyes and looked at her white palms. She was tall, so her palms were naturally beautiful and fair. No. His voice was stiff. But then he thought of Su Xiu's words. They were also like 2 children. The fiercer they fought, the more they cared. He should care. Seeing her wearing the ring given by another man, he actually felt very uncomfortable. This kind of discomfort was more than the Tangyu in Pei Qiqi's heart. At least, he had endured Pei Qiqi for 2 years. If there were no accidents, he could endure it for the rest of his life. But Yi Lianqiu, he couldn't. He attributed this couldn't to the fact that she gave birth to a child for him. Self-deceiving straight man cancer. His hand loosened, and the necklace with the ring fell into the toilet. Then there was a sound of water. It's washed away. He smiled at her. So there's no need to think about it anymore? Yi Lianqiu looked at him and turned around. Qin Anlin, you are childish. When he couldn't see her, she smiled lightly. Would he die of anger tomorrow? Qin Anlin looked at her back and went forward to hug her waist from behind. He put his face on her shoulder. He is not childish? His hot breath was on the side of her neck. Yi Lianqiu couldn't stand it, but she still said stubbornly, it's not easy to compare. He let go of her immediately, and his face was a little dark. Did she really want to compare? Qin Anlin took off his bathrobe and slept in the second bedroom. He seemed to be in a bad mood. But at 1 o'clock in the morning, he actually fell asleep because she was next door. The next morning, when he woke up, he was licked. He reached out and touched it. It was a furry little head. Qin Amlin opened his eyes and saw little Mu Yun. Morning. His voice was a little hoarse as he kissed the little head in his arms. Little Mu Yun's face was a little red. He raised his head and said, "Mommy made breakfast. Daddy is up." Qin Amlin rarely slept so soundly. He lay flat and looked at the sky outside. He grabbed the watch on the bedside table and looked at the time. It was almost 9 o'clock. He sat up, stretched his body, and picked up the lamb with one hand. "Wash your face and brush your teeth with Daddy." Little Mu Yun's face was still slightly red, but he didn't refuse. An adult and a child stood together in the bathroom brushing their teeth, looking quite loving. When Yi Lianxiu stood at the door, her eyes were filled with tears. At this moment, she felt sorry for Mu Yun, for the past, for the present, for the future. Her tone was very indifferent. "Breakfast." Qin Amlin tilted his head and looked at her. "I'll be done in a while." He looked at her a little longer and found that she usually liked to wear long dresses at home. She was quite feminine. He smiled and reached out to take off his bathrobe. When he walked into the changing room, he realized that he hadn't packed his luggage. But when he opened the cabinet, his clothes were already neatly hung. Each of them had the faint scent of his favorite detergent. He took out a set of clothes and put them on. When he walked out, little Mu Yun was already sitting at the dining table. Yi Lianxiu was helping him eat breakfast. The morning light shone on her face, making her look gentle and beautiful. Even her hair was hazy. Chapter 1339. There was nothing in front of him. Chinese breakfast. President Qin might not like it, but you can call for customer service. Yi Lianxiu sat down and had breakfast with little Mu Yun. Qin Amlin looked at the food in front of them and frowned. "Are you sure you want to call me President Qin in front of Mu Yun?" Yi Lianxiu glanced at him and didn't say anything else. Qin Amlin reached out and took the bowl from her hands, as well as 2 small plates of side dishes, and began to eat just like that. "Daddy, don't you think it's dirty?" Little Mu Yun said seriously. "Mommy said saliva can spread a lot of germs." Qin Amlin raised an eyebrow and looked at Yi Lianxiu. "You said that?" Yi Lianxiu glared at him. "I said that. Then we've kissed so many times. Why didn't you think you were dirty and—" He stopped. She immediately covered his mouth. "Don't talk nonsense. You told me not to mess around last night, and now you're telling me not to talk nonsense." He smiled and pushed her hand away. "Lianxiu, don't mess around. Let me eat properly." "Huh?" She put down her hand angrily and glared at him. But he smiled. "That's it?" She went to get a bowl of food. When she was eating, they started arguing again. Little Mu Yun looked at them and felt that they hadn't grown up yet. Qin Amlin finished his breakfast and said calmly, "There will be a meeting at King Entertainment this afternoon. I'll leave in a bit and be back around 8 p.m. Although his tone was calm, Yi Lianxiu was a little stunned. She looked at him for a long time before saying, "You didn't have to come back last night." He was already full and looked straight at her. "I told Mu Yun that I would come back. Just because of this?" Her heart skipped a beat. She had to admit that although he was a jerk, he was a good father. "There's no need to be touched." Qin Amlin wiped his lips and got up. He touched little Mu Yun's head and said in a low voice, "Daddy will be back tonight." Little Mu Yun said, "Then Daddy has to rest well." Qin Amlin smiled. This child, how obedient. He lifted his gaze and looked at Yi Lianxiu. She blushed and turned her face away uncomfortably. He smiled and got up to change into a more formal suit. Yi Lianxiu followed him and stood at the entrance of the changing room. "Is the situation at King Entertainment still not good?" He took out his jacket and put it on, looking straight at her. "Do you think King Entertainment is in trouble because of Tang Yu?" She didn't say anything, which meant that she agreed. Qin Amlin lowered his eyes and smiled. After a while, he said, "Tang Yu has no interest in the entertainment industry." She looked at him and wanted to ask more, but he slowly walked in front of her and placed his long index finger on her lips. His voice was very light. "Don't ask too much. Otherwise, I'll think that you care about me. What if I do?" She still looked at him very calmly, but she said the words that tugged at his heartstrings. Qin Anlin's body trembled. He looked at her after a long while. He smiled slightly and rubbed his finger lightly on her lips. He didn't say anything. When he left, her body felt a little weak. Something seemed different. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the change in his heart. Qin Anlin left the suite, but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he went to greet Lady Qin. Chapter 1340. Qin Anlin touched his nose. Just now, Liangqiu called me President Qin. Now, Mom, you should call me that too. He was in a bad situation now. Everyone hated him. You deserve it. Lady Qin put away her things and looked at her son. After a while, she said softly, "Do you have something important to do?" Qin Anlin pursed his lips. "Mom, I think you know the current situation of King Entertainment." Lady Qin's gaze also sharpened. She sneered. "So now is the best way to unite with ATV by marriage." When she said that, Qin Anlin shook his head. "Mom, why are you so muddled? Mr. Su is someone who eats people without spitting out the bones. Do you think I can stop his ambition after marrying Su Qing? At least you could delay it and ease it." Lady Qin's tone was a little cruel. "Anlin, sacrificing Su Qing is nothing for King Entertainment." She paused. "Anyway, you have Yu Liangqiu. In the future, even if you don't want to touch Su Qing, it's fine. You just have to get along on the surface." The reason why Lady Qin said this was because she knew that Su Qing was gay. Su Qing wouldn't like Anlin, and Anlin naturally wouldn't like her either. Qin Anlin smiled. "Mom, do you think Mr. Su will still marry Su Qing to me now? What we think is also what he thinks." Lady Qin's eyes were scheming. "This is the time to compete in patience." Qin Anlin said without thinking, "I won't put Mu Yun and Yi Liangqiu in that kind of unbearable situation." "She is now." Lady Qin's voice was extremely stern. "Have you forgotten your relationship with Pei Chi-Chi?" Qin Anlin clenched his fists and said in a depressed voice, "I will dissolve the marriage with Chi-Chi." Lady Qin's eyes were a little horrified. "Anlin, you're crazy. This is a life-saving straw for you and King Entertainment. You should know when to use it. Mom, if everything in my life is used to calculate, then what's the point of living?" Qin Anlin forced a smile. "That's it. I'll take care of my personal affairs." He turned around and left. Lady Qin was furious. Crisp Xiu rushed over and patted her chest, coaxing, "All right, old mistress, young master has grown up and has his own ideas. You see, he already has a son. Naturally, he wouldn't want to lose the prestige of a father in front of his son. This time, you should let the young master solve these troublesome matters by himself. Just enjoy your life." There was a touch of sorrow in Lady Qin's eyes. "Of course I want to, but Crisp Xiu, Anlin wasn't like this in the past. In the past, Anlin would do anything to achieve his goals. But now, what had he changed?" Milky White Sleeve sighed. "Young master is probably lonely. He needs people to understand him." "Lonely?" Lady Qin was stunned for a moment. She was in a daze for a long time before she smiled. "Then what about my loneliness? Crisp Xiu, look at that Yu Liangqiu. She's so cold and doesn't have a trace of humanity in her. Can she bring happiness to Anlin?" "Old mistress, it's fine as long as young master likes her." Crisp Xiu patted her on the back. "Be good, don't be crazy." Lady Qin seemed to be holding her breath. After a while, she finally relaxed. "I feel terrible in my heart. There's only that vixen and that little bastard in Anlin's heart." Chapter 1341. Young master looks like a smart child. Besides, didn't you check it out? It's not a life-threatening disease. He'll be fine when he grows up. Soft Sleeve paused. "I heard that if you have another child with this disease, you can use stem cells from the umbilical cord to transplant it. That way he'll be fine." Lady Qin's gaze was a little hesitant. Finally, she sighed. "Let him be." Soft Sleeve finally let out a sigh of relief. However, Lady Qin muttered, "Look at that woman. She didn't even come here to see me. She really doesn't care about an old thing like me. Missy doesn't know that the old lady is here either. Soft sleeves seem to be coaxing a child. If the old lady wants to see her grandson, we can go and see him another day. Another day? I'm already going back to be city tomorrow. The old lady's temper flared up again. Soft sleeve laughed in her heart, but her words couldn't be more serious. All right, then we'll go and see him later. The old lady was unhappy again. If you want to go, you go. I won't go. After saying that, she started chanting Buddhist scriptures again. Soft sleeve sighed. The old lady still disliked Miss Ye's low family status, while she was thinking that Lady Chin had already spoken again. Her family status is a little low, but what I don't like about her is that she's too scheming. Anlin can't catch her at all. Soft sleeve didn't say anything. Missy was indeed not easy to deal with. In the end, she still didn't see him. Lady Chin returned to Bee City in the afternoon. She really didn't trust Anlin to fight with that old fox of the Sioux family in Bee City. Chin Anlin sat in the back seat of the car, looking down at the documents. After a while, he said indifferently, "Come, what do you think Mr. Sue's intention is this time?" Kam was a little emotional. "It's obviously a trap." Chin Anlin put down the documents in his hand, his gaze unfathomable. He always likes to pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger. You'll know if he still doesn't want to shed all pretense of cordiality. Kam pursed her lips. Will President Chin really accept his proposal? In today's meeting, Mr. Sue hinted at the marriage between the two families. Chin Anlin's fingers were on the document, and after a long time, he said softly, "In the end, Sue Chung is not their biological daughter. If she was, do you think they would be willing to sacrifice her?" He thought of his mother's words and couldn't help but sigh at Sue Chung. They were raised like kittens and puppies to relieve boredom. When it was time to make use of them, they wouldn't be soft-hearted at all. Khan nodded. Yes, they have never given up looking for their biological daughter. Sue Chung is just a stepping stone. He paused for a moment, then looked at Chin Anlin. Then why didn't President Chin reject it? I can't let Mr. Sue know the importance of Liang Xiao and Mu Yun to me. I'll deal with it first, Chin Anlin said and closed his eyes. Kam didn't say anything for a long time. Chin Anlin opened his eyes and realized what he had said. He paused and looked at Kam. Don't talk nonsense. Kam held back his laughter. Got it, President Chin? From now on, don't call me President Chin. Chin Anlin was hard to please today. Kam was stunned. Then what should I call you? Chin Anlin snorted. Forget it. Kam felt that President Chin was very awkward. He was a little worried. Was it menopause? But President Chin was only in his early 30s. It shouldn't be. But then he thought about it. Wasn't a man in love like this? Chin Anlin, on the other hand, couldn't calm down. He cared about Yi Lianxiu not only because of Mu Yun, but also because he hadn't forgotten her all these years. Chapter 1342. Seeing him like this, Kam didn't say anything. Chin Anlin closed his eyes to rest. They were on the way to the Bee City airport. At 5 in the afternoon, there was a traffic jam on the road. The car started and stopped. Suddenly, the driver's voice turned serious. President Chin, the brakes don't seem to be working. Chin Anlin opened his eyes. The car wasn't going fast, but they were on the road and could be in danger at any time. I just sent it for maintenance 2 days ago. The driver's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead. His entire body was tense. Chin Anlin frowned, his lips pressed into a straight line. Drive out and try not to hit other cars. Pick a green belt and stop the car. The driver was hesitant. His forehead was covered in sweat, and so was his back. Even if he stopped the car at this speed, he couldn't be sure if he would get hurt. But there was no other way. After looking left and right for a while, he finally picked a direction and drove straight in that direction. He instinctively stepped on the brakes, but the brakes gave way. The car lost control and crashed into the green belt with a loud bang. The car tilted forward, lifted up, and then retreated. The wheel spun a few times before it came to a stop. The hood was smoking, and the crash was unrecognizable. Chin Anlin's body also suddenly leaned forward. After an intense collision, he finally steadied himself with great difficulty. He took a deep breath and moved his body. Feeling fine, he said slowly, "Just say that I'm injured." Kam understood and nodded. "Yes, I got it." Chin Anlin held his forehead. This has something to do with Mr. Su. That was why he never thought that marrying Su Chang would change anything. An hour later, Chin Anlin arrived at Xingyuan Hospital's emergency room. The media rushed over like sharks that smelled blood. They surrounded Xingyuan Hospital and reported on King Entertainment's President Chin Anlin's car accident. Kim stood in the VIP ward, his tone solemn. "President Chin, we have indeed found out that Mr. Su is secretly buying shares of King Entertainment. But from the looks of it, King Entertainment's foundation has not been shaken. He can only make a small fuss and won't be able to change anything." Chin Anlin narrowed his eyes and looked at an unknown place in front of him. He sneered. He finally couldn't help it. Kam couldn't help but say, "President Chin, in the past, Mr. Su was just sticking to his own pattern. After all, ATV is enough for him to gain a foothold in the entertainment industry, and he has always had a good relationship with the Chin family." Chin Anlin looked at Kim and said slowly, "Do you know why my father abandoned his wife and son?" Kim froze for a moment. She didn't expect that President Chin would say such a private thing to her. "And does this have anything to do with Mr. Su?" Chin Anlin said slowly, "That woman was my father's first love. She left for so many years, but she suddenly came back. Could it be a coincidence?" He had checked. Everything had been arranged by Mr. Su, and he didn't tell his mother about this. The past couldn't be changed, so why add to the sadness? Back then, when his father left, he took away a lot of money. At that time, Mr. Su wanted to buy King Entertainment in the name of helping, but his mother didn't agree. All these years, Mr. Su hadn't given up. Chin Anlin also had to settle this score with him. Settle it later, settle it early, settle it all together. Chapter 1343. Chin Anlin nodded. After a pause, he said, "Spread the news that I have a concussion and may have to be hospitalized for a week." Kam was a little surprised. After a long time, he said hesitantly, "But President Chin, this will definitely cause King Entertainment's shares to plummet. Then buy back a lot." Chin Anlin's gaze was a little distant. "Do it secretly. Don't let Mr. Su find out. Also, break through the normal ATV." He wouldn't sit back and wait. He would definitely fight back. Kim nodded. "Mr. Su will definitely propose marriage again." Chin Anlin's gaze was a little unfathomable. He picked up the document beside him and said, "This is for my mother." Kim took it. Before he left, he still said, "President Chin, should we inform Miss Yi about your injuries?" Actually, it wasn't a serious injury. It was just a slight sprain in his arm. However, Kim felt that this was the best time to sublimate their relationship. Chin Anlin glanced at him and said in a low voice, "Do you think it's appropriate for her to come at this juncture?" Kim was rebuffed and didn't say anything. Chin Anlin's voice softened. "Give me the phone." Kim nodded and handed the phone to him. Chin Anlin wanted to make a call, but he found that Kim was still standing there. He curled his lips. "What are you still standing there for?" Kim touched his nose and left. When there was only Chin Anlin in the ward, he looked at the phone and slid his fingers across it. He didn't make the call for a long time. 5 minutes later, he made the call. Yi Liangxiu picked up the phone. Her voice was warm and soothing. Chin Anlin's impetuous mood calmed down a lot. His voice was low and slow. "I won't be coming back tonight." "Oh." She only said one word to him. Chin Anlin snorted. "You sure are a man of few words." "Yi Liangxiu, are you also like this when facing Lin Xingyuan?" "President Chin, when you're facing Pei Chi-Chi, you're also much gentler than when you're facing me." She suddenly became very harsh. Chin Anlin reached for the water beside him and was about to drink, but he spat it all out. He frowned and looked at her. "Yi Liangxiu, can you be more gentle? When I face President Chin, I can't think of these 2 words." Her tone was a little awkward. Chin Anlin looked out the window and watched as the dark night slowly descended. Then he listened to her awkward little feelings, and even his heart softened a little. Lianxiu, I'll go back in a few days. In a few days? She caught the meaning behind his words and bit her lip. After a long time, she finally asked, Qin Amlin, did something happen to you? You care about me? He asked naturally. Yi Lianxiu snorted coldly. In your dreams. Yi Lianxiu, nothing happened to me. It's just that there are a few newcomers in the company. He suddenly said this. But after he said this, there was no more sound from the other side. He waited for a long time. Other than hearing her soft and shallow breathing, she didn't say a word. Qin Amlin's heart actually beat a little faster. He coughed lightly. I'm just joking. He was coaxing her, right? After he said this, he felt his heart beating even faster as he waited for her reaction. After a long time, she said, Up to you. After that, she hung up the phone. Qin Amlin looked at his phone. She was angry just like that, but he still called back shamelessly. She didn't pick up the first time. He called a few times. Chapter 1344. He replied seriously, You should know what I want to do. What a rogue. Yi Lianxiu admitted that she blushed. She covered her face and tried to sound as cold as possible. Aren't there a few newbies? He coughed softly. I have a wife and children now. Of course, I can't be casual anymore. Yes, you still have Pei Chi-Chi. She kept reminding him of the stupid things he did. Qin Amlin restrained himself and said gently, Where is Mu Yun? I want to talk to him. Yi Lianxiu looked at Lin Xingyuan and little Mu Yun, and then cleared her throat. He and Xingyuan are playing with building blocks. He may not have time to answer your call. Qin Amlin was mad. He was worried about them, but she was fine. Lin Xingyuan came to her as soon as he left. Yi Lianxiu, don't forget your identity. He pretended to be cold and held the phone with his fingers. Then Yi Lianxiu said coldly, I'm sorry, President Qin. I don't seem to be married. Qin Amlin's voice was deep with unknown anger. We have a child. Qin Amlin, I gave birth to him. It has nothing to do with you. She was probably confused because she was so angry that she spoke incoherently like him. Without me, can you give birth to Muyin? With your fingers? He asked shamelessly. Yi Lianxiu hung up the phone. As soon as she looked up, she saw Lin Xingyuan's thoughtful gaze. Her face was a little hot. What are you looking at? Lin Xingyuan smiled lightly. Lianxiu, you seem to have put on weight recently. She touched her face and was a little doubtful. Have I? His gaze was deep, but what he didn't say was, Lianxiu, do you know that even when you are quarreling with Qin Amlin, your whole body and face seem to be glowing, and your eyes will be particularly bright. At that time, you are the real you. You've always had him in your heart, but you just didn't want to admit it. Perhaps this was something that I was unwilling to admit. Lin Xingyuan smiled lightly. Yes, you've gained weight. He looked at her warmly. Lianxiu, if you still like him, how about, he didn't say the rest, but she understood. Yi Lianxiu felt a little sad for Lin Xingyuan. Her fingers gently touched her neck, where Lin Xingyuan had given her the ring. She admitted that she was a coward. She did not dare to love anymore. She would rather live a peaceful life. Lin Xingyuan could give her peace. Lin Xingyuan looked at her dazed gaze and smiled bitterly. He walked over slowly and untied the necklace on her neck. He said lightly, Lianxiu, I regret it. I should have given this to another girl. You have to understand the suffering of a doctor with a low income. Yi Lianxiu snatched it away. Don't be like this, Lin Xingyuan. She put it on again, childishly. Since it's given to me, it's mine. He had a car accident. Lin Xingyuan looked at her and suddenly said. Yi Lianxiu looked up at him. You might not have seen the news this afternoon. Lin Xingyuan smiled bitterly. He can't come back because he's hospitalized. Yi Lianxiu stared at him for a few seconds and then searched on her phone. Sure enough, the entertainment headlines were the news of Qin Amlin being hospitalized. Concussion? She was stunned. Chapter 1345. Yi Lianxiu's eyes were still glued to the phone screen, and her grip on the phone was very tight. After a long while, she hugged little Mu Yun tightly. Lin Xingyuan took the child from her hands and said, "I'll take you to the airport." She was a little surprised. Lin Xingyuan smiled and said, "I've already booked the plane tickets." Yi Lianqiu looked straight at him and said softly after a long while, "Xingyuan, thank you." Lin Xingyuan held little Mu Yun with one hand and held her with the other. He was also full of boyfriend power. At night, as the car drove on the highway, he looked at the people behind from the rearview mirror. Little Mu Yun had already fallen asleep, and his little face was tilted on his mother's shoulder. Yi Lianqiu's gaze was looking out of the window, and no one knew what she was thinking. Lin Xingyuan's fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his lips were pursed into a straight line. He drove all the way to the airport of H City. He bought some food for little Mu Yun and put it in the trunk of the car. Now, he brought it to Yi Lianqiu and said, "Give him some when he wakes up." Yi Lianqiu had a lot to say to him, but she couldn't say a word. Lin Xingyuan sighed and said, "Hurry up and go. Whether it's for Mu Yun or for yourself." "I'm doing it for Mu Yun." She looked at him and then lowered her head. It was rare for her to be like this. Lin Xingyuan smiled and said, "Lianqiu, when you lie, you don't even dare to look into people's eyes. Do you know that?" "Ah?" She looked up at him immediately. Lin Xingyuan smiled again and reached out to rub Mu Yun's hair. "All right, hurry up and go. We'll reach B City soon." "Xingyun," she called his name. He had already turned his back to her, but now he slowly turned his head back and smiled warmly. "Lianqiu, I'm still there. If you're unhappy in B City, then go back. Understand?" He reached out and touched her head, as gentle as a brother. "Go." He ordered himself to withdraw his hand, ordered himself to leave. He told himself that she still liked Qin Anlin, and Qin Anlin obviously liked her too. He loved Lianqiu not because he wanted her, but because he wanted her to be happy. Only Qin Anlin could give her happiness. It was late at night at the airport. People were coming and going in the departure lounge. Lin Xingyun was getting further and further away. Yi Lianqiu raised her hand slightly, but then put it down again. Little Mu Yun looked at Lin Xingyuan's back in confusion and asked in a daze, "Mummy, isn't Uncle Lin coming with us?" Yi Lianqiu didn't answer. She just hugged her son. "Let's go in." Xingyuan Hospital, B City. Late at night, an uninvited guest came to Qin Anlin's ward. It was Su Chung. Su Chung was carrying a backpack and dressed brightly. She asked her assistant to stand outside and walked in. She bent down and kissed Qin Anlin's face. Her voice was crisp and clear. "Anlin, go." Qin Anlin opened his eyes and looked at Su Chung. "It's you." He sat up and supported his forehead with his hand. "Why did you come so late?" Su Chung sat on the small sofa beside his bed and played with her fingernails. "Daddy asked me to come and see you." He said. She kept him in suspense. Qin Anlin smiled lazily. "Chung Chung, if you're smart, you should have married yourself long ago. There's no need to force yourself." Chapter 1346. Su Chung peeled a fruit for herself. As she stuffed it in her mouth, she smiled and said, "I'm not getting married. I want to tie Anlin Ge down." "Anlin Ge, you don't even know how useful you are." Qin Anlin's face darkened. He looked at her for a while before smiling. "Is that so?" He paused. "Then why did you provoke Yi Sun in the past?" Su Cheng's expression changed. She looked at Qin Anlin and asked cautiously, "It's been so many years. Why are you suddenly asking about this?" Anlin Ge had never asked about it in the past. Was he suspecting something now? Qin Anlin smiled faintly. "You should know about my relationship with Yi Lianqiu. Yi Sun is her little brother, Chung Chung. Or do you think I shouldn't ask?" Su Chung felt uneasy. She looked at Qin Anlin for a long time before saying softly, "Anlin Ge, have you fallen in love with her?" "Chung Chung, I'm asking about you and Yi Sun," he answered her seriously. Su Chung looked at him. Her eyes widened, and there was a hint of hurt in them. However, Qin Anlin was unmoved. Because he was the best-looking guy at that time, Su Chung started to throw a tantrum and raised her voice. "I like him, but I never thought that he would try to rape me." She lowered her head and played with her fingers, not saying a word. "Is that really the case?" Qin Anlin's voice was heavy. Why did you humiliate him later on? Su Cheng's voice was soft and filled with protest. Anlin Go, how could I remember such a long time ago? She hugged his arm and acted coquettishly. Qin Amlin's eyes did not have a trace of warmth. He always felt that it was not that simple. He had only recently found out that Su Cheng was a lesbian. So, why did she express her affection for Yi Sun at that time? Shouldn't it be indifference? Pursing his thin lips, he looked at Su Cheng and was about to say something when the door was pushed open. He looked up and his gaze froze for a moment. Standing at the door was Yi Lianxiu. She held Mu Yun in her arms. Seeing Su Cheng holding Qin Anlin in her arms, Su Cheng's face was full of shyness. And now it was late at night. Yi Lianxiu looked at him and Su Cheng and smiled faintly. It seemed that she had come at the wrong time, or rather, she should not have come. When he was about to leave, Su Cheng let go of Qin Anlin's arm and said sweetly, Sister Lianxiu, you are here? She walked over and looked at Mu Yun in Yi Lianxiu's arms. Her voice was a little softer. Is Mu Yun here too? She turned around. Anling, I'll leave first. She paused for a moment and said, as if she wanted to see the world in chaos, Stay a little longer, or my dad will catch you and discuss our marriage again. Qin Amlin's gaze fell on Yi Lianxiu's face, but his words were directed at Su Cheng. Worry about yourself. Su Cheng smiled warmly. However, he left without any hesitation. After she left, Yi Lianxiu was still standing there. Qin Anlin frowned. Isn't it tiring to hold Mu Yun like this? Seeing that she didn't move, he simply lifted the quilt, walked over, carried little Mu Yun, and put him on his bed. He went into the bathroom to wash his face. He was a little annoyed after dealing with so many people for half a day. Yi Lianxiu followed in and looked at him up and down. There seems to be nothing wrong with you. He grunted, and I came at the wrong time. With a beauty as a companion, President Qin should be very comfortable living in this courtyard. Chapter 1347. She was dressed simply, but it couldn't hide her beauty. Moreover, it was rare for her to sulk at him, which made her look a little cute. Qin Anlin smiled, reached behind his back, and pulled her over. She was a little embarrassed as she was placed in his arms. Qin Anlin, what are you doing? I miss you a little. He hugged her with both hands, hugging her along with her arms in his embrace. He lowered his head and kissed her neck, lingering behind her ear. Qin Anlin, this is a ward. Her voice was trembling. Mu Yun is still outside. Keep your voice down then, he said shamelessly as he unbuttoned her shirt one by one. He held her and began to tease her slowly. Yi Lianxiu bit her lip and said in a trembling voice, Qin Anlin, let go of me. At this moment, he had already succeeded. He leaned on her back and nibbled on her neck. His voice was extremely hoarse. You're the one who won't let go of me. Can you feel it? He was shameless. Yi Lianxiu struggled with all her might, but she couldn't win against him in the end. Her body went limp. He reached out and picked her up, kissed her, and smiled like a spring breeze. No matter how fierce she was usually, she was as soft as water at this moment. His voice was low and hoarse. Lianxiu, you miss me too, don't you? No. She gritted her teeth to prevent herself from making such a shameful sound. But he was deliberately torturing her until she completely let go of herself. And Qin Anlin seemed to have endured it for a long time. He did it 4 times in a row, not even bothering to change his position. In the end, he bit her delicate neck lazily and slowly. Lianxiu, we're going back to City H tomorrow. Although his voice was lazy, there was a hint of command in it. Yi Lianxiu woke up and her body stiffened. Are you afraid that I'll ruin your plans? He was a little annoyed and ended it hastily. He leaned on her back and panted for a long time before saying softly, the situation is unstable now. I feel more at ease with you and Mu Yun in City H. He scooped her up and carried her to the shower for a quick shower. At this moment, she was already limp and her body was still trembling on his shoulder. Qin Anlin couldn't help kissing her and smiled. You're so useless. She came back to her senses. I'm not here to have sex with you. We didn't have sex. He picked her words. Lianxiu, we just had sex. She reached out to hit him, but he dodged her and looked at her with a burning gaze. Didn't you come because you were worried about me? You think too much. At this moment, she had regained her strength. She pushed him away and walked to the changing room to put on a bathrobe. Then she slowly turned back and looked at him. Seeing you like this, I don't think I should have come. Is it because I'm not injured, or is it because of Su Chung? He leaned against the door, his gaze focused. Because I'm not injured, or because of Su Chung? He leaned against the door, his gaze focused. He slowly walked over and lifted her chin. Is it because of Su Chung? No. It was just that she answered too quickly, so it seemed like she was trying to hide something. He slowly walked over and lifted her chin. Is it because of Su Chung? No. But she answered too quickly, so it seemed like she was trying to cover it up. He let go of her. You've been busy for a long time. Go to sleep. Chapter 1348. Qin Anlin looked at her and coughed. I'll coax him later. Right now, he really wanted to hug her to sleep. After so many years, he was a little tired. In the end, she was dragged to the bed by him. The poor little Mu Yun was carried to the sofa by the side. The big bed was occupied by the naughty father, and so was the mother, who was occupied by the father. Qin Anlin lay flat and watched Yi Liangxiu take the medicine. Then, he looked at what medicine it was, and his face darkened. Why are you still taking this? Aren't you afraid of harming your body? He knocked the medicine away from her hand, but Yi Liangxiu picked it up and swallowed it again. Qin Anlin's face darkened as he looked at her. You've already given birth to one. Is there a difference between giving birth to two and one? Of course there is. Having one is young and ignorant, but having two is stupid. She looked a little bitter as she drank a mouthful of water. Qin Anlin's romantic thoughts were completely destroyed by her. He looked at her and said, You look stupid enough now. He lay down in a huff and turned his back to her. Yi Liangxiu also lay flat. Aren't you stupid? His back stiffened. He waited for a long time, but she didn't say anything. He turned his body and hugged her. He used his legs to hold her and his arms to hug her tightly. Yes, I'm very stupid now. She opened her eyes and looked at him. Qin Anlin, I can't afford to play your game. Then, what is it now? What did we do 4 times in the bathroom just now? Was it just your physical needs? He stared at her eyes and was a little aggressive. Yi Liangxiu asked, What about you? He held her cheek with one hand. Because I want you. She kicked him. Qin Anlin was a little more clear-headed now. He had lost control just now. He didn't want her to come, and he didn't want her to get involved. Tomorrow, he still wanted to send her away, so he pursed his lips. Tomorrow, I'll get Kaim to send you away. Her body was a little cold. Qin Anlin, in your heart, Mu Yun and I can only stay in City H, right? She said it tactfully, but the meaning was clear. Could it be that his spouse would never be her, Yi Liangxiu? Mu Yun would always be an illegitimate child? Qin Anlin looked at her. For now, it's better for you to stay in City H, because you're going to marry Su Chung, right? She wasn't completely clueless. Madame Qin's attitude and elder sister Ying's news. She had always known that the Su family and Qin family were preparing for a marriage alliance, but no one had expected Pei Qiqi to appear in the middle. When she asked this, Qin Anlin sat up and lowered his head to look at her. Liangxiu, if there's anything you want, you can just say it. I'll give you whatever I can. I don't want anything. Even if I want something, you can't give it to me. She smiled. Do you think I want marriage? No, I never want it. She sat up and looked at the night sky outside. What she wanted was respect. She didn't want to be ordered around like a kitten or a puppy. When he needed her, he could give her whatever he could. When he didn't want her, she had to leave. They were separated by the wall of a wealthy family. She couldn't walk in, and he didn't walk out for her. Such a relationship was too fragile. He looked at her. He knew that she didn't trust him, but he couldn't tell her so much now. He would rather she leave this troublesome place for the first time. He wanted to protect her. Not for Mu Yun, but for her. Because she was his Yi Liangxiu. Chapter 1349. Downstairs of the hospital, Su Chung was sitting in a white sports car. She leaned against the back of the seat and looked at the cigarette between her fingers. She was back. Su Chung looked up and blew out a smoke ring. She was back. Sister Lianxio, what can I do to you? Su Chung said with a wicked tone as she pinched the cigarette. You forced me to do this? We could have coexisted in this world. But why did you appear again and again? Did you force me to do it again and again? That's not cute. Su Chung smiled weirdly. She dialed a number, and the call went through. It took a long time for someone to pick up. The voice on the other end sounded tired. What's up? Su Chung narrowed her eyes and asked coldly. Why is she in City B? Didn't you say that you would stay with her? The person on the other end of the line was silent for a moment before saying softly, She is an adult, and I think you know who she loves. I don't want to hear this. Su Cheng's voice was a little agitated and crazy. I just want to ask why you didn't stop her. Aren't you the best at using your deep love drama? After a long time, the person on the other end of the line said, If I were with her, would you let us go? Su Cheng laughed and giggled. How greedy. Isn't it enough that you have me? The person on the other end of the line hung up gently. Su Cheng was a little confused. Damn it. How dare he hang up on her? The phone slipped from her fingers and fell on the seat. Su Cheng laughed softly. Disobedient, right? There was only one outcome for disobedient people. And she couldn't let you Lianxio stay. If she stayed, her dear parents would find out her little secret sooner or later. And this wasn't what she wanted. Sister Lianxio, I'm sorry. You can't stay in City B, or it won't be fun. Su Cheng laughed crazily and started the car, late at night, in the Su family's mansion. Mr. Su hadn't slept yet. He was sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper as if he was waiting for her. Seeing Su Cheng enter, Mr. Su closed the newspaper in his hand and turned to look at his daughter. Chung, how is Amlin? Su Cheng stuck out her tongue, dropped the bag in her hand, and came over to massage Mr. Su's shoulders. Her voice was a little coquettish. Dad, I'm going to be stupid. Are you stupid? Our Chung doesn't want to get married, right? Mr. Su patted her hand and said, Don't worry about it. Your mother and I will handle it for you. He paused for a moment. I heard that someone went to look for him today. Is that right? Su Chung turned around and sat on the sofa's armrest. She played with her delicate fingernails, showing her girlish demeanor. Dad, why are you still asking when you already know the answer? Mr. Su couldn't help but smile. How could you hide this kind of thing from Dad? You should have told me earlier, and let me vent your anger for you. Su Ching stuck out her tongue and said, I don't want to. Dad, don't listen to other people's nonsense. Anlin Ge has Pei Chi in his heart. Yi Lianxio is nothing to be afraid of. Mr. Su looked at her. Chung, do you really think so? Su Cheng's eyes narrowed slightly. After a while, she said softly, Of course, Dad. Is there a problem? Chapter 1350. A strange look appeared in Su Cheng's eyes. She forced a smile, looked at her father, and coughed lightly. Dad, can't I inherit ATVs? Mr. Su glanced at her, his eyes full of love, and smiled. Dad can't bear for you to worry about it. He patted the back of Su Cheng's hand. All right, go to bed early. Didn't you always say that sleeping late is bad for your skin? Su Cheng still wanted to say something, but Mr. Su had already stood up and walked upstairs. She looked at his back and secretly clenched her teeth. This old thing was obviously guarding against her. He clearly didn't see her as his own daughter, and he even said that he was afraid she would be too tired. Did this old thing think she didn't know that they hadn't given up on finding their own daughter? They wanted her to become a sacrifice and marry Qin Anlin as cannon fodder so that their own daughter could inherit the family business? Then they had underestimated her. Not only did she find her daughter before them, but they were so close, and even her mother had seen Yi Lianxio before, but she didn't recognize her. Instead, she thought that Yi Lianxio was an indecent woman. Just thinking about it made her feel ironic. Su Cheng pursed her lips and slowly sat up. After so many years, she looked like a princess, but in fact, she wasn't even a substitute. At most, she was just a dog raised by the Su family. When the owner gave her some food, she had to wag her tail. How could she be willing to be a dog for the rest of her life? And that princess was Yi Liangxiu, the Yi Liangxiu that she didn't want to see the most. Mr. Su went upstairs. Mrs. Su had just finished showering and was sitting in front of the vanity mirror applying skincare products. Hearing Mr. Su's footsteps, she looked up. Cheng is back. Mr. Su nodded and sat on the bed, the mattress sinking deep into the ground. He looked at Mrs. Su and said lightly, "In the future, you should properly discipline Cheng. She is a girl, and she shouldn't be out running wild all day long. It doesn't make sense for her to come home in the middle of the night." Mrs. Su glanced at him. "Didn't you ask her to visit Anlin?" Mr. Su paused for a moment, then said, soft-hearted. His slightly cold attitude made Mrs. Su a little unhappy. She threw down the skincare products in her hands. Who was the one who wanted to carry Cheng back? Now, Su, do you think I don't know what you're thinking? Yes, biological children are naturally different. However, it has been so many years. If we could find her, we would have found her long ago. Why give up on Cheng for such a slim hope? After saying that, Mrs. Su could not stop herself from crying. Right now, you are pushing Cheng into a pit of fire. Mr. Su felt a little embarrassed and sat up all of a sudden. What are you talking about? You've seen Amlin grow up since he was a child. Although he is a bit romantic, he has not done anything wrong. Yes, that's because I didn't know what you were thinking before. It's different now. You have the ambition of a wolf. You're already so old, yet you're still thinking of schemes. Aren't you tired? Mrs. Su said angrily. Mr. Su looked at Mrs. Su with a solemn expression. Women should not interfere in men's affairs. Mrs. Su was not one to be trifled with. She snorted coldly. Then, don't even think about marrying Cheng to Qin Anlin. If you force her, I will take Cheng and run away from home. You! Mr. Su was furious. A woman's view. That you're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.